afternoon. Welcome to this combined Medical Grand Rounds, Medical Center Hour, and History of the Health Sciences lecture. I'm Marcia Day Childress from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities, and we're so pleased to see all of you here today. As I mentioned, this is a combined program of Medical Grand Rounds, Medical Center Hour, and the History of the Health Sciences lectures. The program is A Plague on All Our Houses, Medical Intrigue, Hollywood, and the Discovery of AIDS. I bet you're wondering how all that comes together. 35 years now after the discovery of AIDS, the story of this disease and the momentous scientific, medical, and socio-political changes it occasioned is rich and complicated, even sensational. In 1981, Dr. Michael Gottlieb, a young UCLA immunologist, saw a cluster of 5 cases of immune dysfunction and unusual opportunistic infections in gay men. He wrote this up and published it in the New England Journal of Medicine. Not long after, as personal physician to Hollywood actor and AIDS patient Rock Hudson, Dr. Gottlieb became the medical face of this terrifying epidemic. In this program, Dr. Bruce Hillman, who was a medical school classmate of Michael Gottlieb, probes the war of egos, money, academic power, and Hollywood clout that advanced AIDS research in its first decade, even as it compromised the medical scientist who had discovered the disease. As we'll hear, Dr. Hillman draws on interviews with Dr. Gottlieb and others to chronicle one of the most important and contentious medical discoveries of our time. Many of us here remember the early days of AIDS, frightening, formative, but we may not know this particular story. And many of us know Bruce Hillman as a radiologist, indeed as chair of UVA's Department of Radiology for more than a decade. But for many years now, Bruce has also been a writer. And the story he'll share with us is a new book, A Plague on All Our Houses, Medical Intrigue, Hollywood, and the Discovery of AIDS. This is a brand new book, published actually just yesterday by 4Edge, the University Press of New England. UVA Bookstore has copies just outside the auditorium upstairs for sale and for signing by the author. I'd like to thank the Department of Medicine and the History of the Health Sciences lecture series from historical collections in the Claude Moore Health Sciences Library for being a part of our bringing you this program. And now we'll flash back to Dr. Hillman's days in medical school at the University of Rochester, where Dr. Michael Gottlieb was his med school classmate. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to come back here. I have many fond memories, and actually, believe it or not, I'm still fully employed here, even though I live elsewhere. But it's great to see old faces, and I certainly appreciate everybody's taking the time to come. Let me say that my professional writing career, if you can call it that, really began with the help of a number of people here, Sharon Hoster in particular. Sharon's in the audience. And I was a part of her critique group, and even when I've left, I return telephonically for help and advice. So thank you, Sharon. So I do have a few disclosures. I did get an advance on the book, and so I am beholden to University Press of New England. I'm on an advisory board for Philips Healthcare, and as already been mentioned, I do have this relationship with Michael Gottlieb from medical school. And you can decide for yourself whether it infringes on the story or not. Why did I write this book? Well, it's not the first creative nonfiction book that I've written. I did write an earlier book called The Man Who Stalked Einstein. But as I was working that book through the editing process and into press, I felt that this was a story that needed telling. I wanted to write a very interesting but instructive story that had an important moral ending. I wanted to provide insights into our world, a very little understood world outside our cloisters of academic medicine. The lessons learned, I think there are important lessons learned both from Gottlieb's experience and also for the whole issue of infectious epidemics. And then it was a very interesting time, and I wanted to talk about the context and time. Now, I have to tell you, I am going to actually spoil the ending. I'm going to tell you what the ending is. I have to tell you there are many rich threads to this story that I simply do not have the time to address today. And so, obviously, I advise you buy the book. Let's start with the cultural backdrop. This era was distinguished by two counterbalancing forces. And we're talking now about the 1970s and the early 1980s. There was a gay emancipation that occurred around this time, sparked in 1969 by the Stonewall Inn riots. Now, many of you may remember what they were. Many of you, I think, probably have never heard of it. But there was a long history of police prejudice towards gay men, and particularly in New York City. And one night, in the very early hours, they raided the Stonewall Inn, which was basically a lowbrow flophouse and bar that was sort of a gay hangout. There were riots, initially in New York and then throughout the country, and it took weeks to quell all of them. But out of it grew a pride in gay identity. Gay individuals who had been cloistered and who had been secretive about their sexual identity began to come out of the closet. There also was what I would call a sexual emancipation that led to tendencies to promiscuity, a whole bathhouse culture. So you may have heard of the bathhouses, the Everard and the Continental in New York. There were the similar bathhouses throughout the large cities of the country. And then gay literature, plays, art, novels. Larry Kramer was particularly influential with his play The Normal Heart that occurred in the mid-1980s. The counterbalancing force was the organization of the religious right. And that was very important because it came at exactly the time, not just of gay emancipation, but also at the time of AIDS. The first reports of AIDS coincided as well. And that was very important. So remember the moral majority. Some of you may or may not remember, but this was an invention of Jerry Falwell. And Jerry Falwell and Paul Weyrith invented the moral majority with the argument that, in fact, the religious right had to organize. Part of the reason they had to organize was, as he said, please remember homosexuals do not reproduce, they recruit. And many of them are after my children and your children. Now, at that time, roughly 20% of the populace was strongly members of the religious right. And for the first time, they organized. Why did they organize? Again, Jerry Falwell. The idea that religion and politics don't mix was invented by the devil to keep Christians from running their own country. If there is any place in the world we need Christianity, it's in Washington. Now, let me step aside for a moment and mention that this is very much how the book is written. When I could, I used the words of the individuals who were relevant at the time. And so rather than narrating it myself, I do a lot of narrating myself, but just as with that, I'm going to quote people if I feel it better tells you the story that I want you to hear. The religious right helped sweep Ronald Reagan into office. And they had unprecedented access to Congress, very conservative Congress at the time, and the administration. And there was a political backlash, not only to gay life, but also to, as I say, to AIDS. It was typified by Nancy Reagan's famous comment, just say no. Just say no replaced sex education in the public schools. So it was a matter of abstinence. If only we could be abstinent, that would end the gay threat and the AIDS threat. In fact, Ronald Reagan never mentioned the word AIDS until 1987. 1981 was the year of its discovery. 1987, just before the end of his term, he mentioned it for the very first time. So let me introduce three characters who I mostly will be quoting throughout this presentation. The first is Dr. Michael Gottlieb. First year as an assistant professor in what he considered his dream job at UCLA. He was professor of immunology in the Department of Medicine. Dr. Andrew Saxon, his division head, associate professor of what he called the CIA, the clinical immunology and allergy division. And Dr. Kenneth Schein, a name that may be familiar to many of you, who was the professor and chair of the Department of Medicine, later to become the dean of the School of Medicine at UCLA, and also to lead the Institute of Medicine. All right, imagine, here you are, you're Michael Gottlieb, in 1981, in your first year of appointment. 10 years now, you've been waiting for this appointment, you've been training, you've been putting aside the desires of family and yourself.
Just give me like a couple seconds.
All right, so at any rate, you've put aside, you've delayed your gratification, you've watched your high school and college friends go on to have comfortable lives, and you finally have your dream job. You've been recruited. You're a hot recruit out of Stanford's Immunology Fellowship, and there you are at UCLA. I'm running out of stuff to say here. Perfect, thank you. All right, so at any rate, he's trying to establish himself in all of the various venues of academics, in clinical work, in teaching, and in research. And he's got a fellow, Howard Shanker, and he says to Shanker, go out and find me some good teaching cases. And sure enough, Shanker comes back with one. He comes back with one at the exact same time that the chairman of the department, Kenneth Schein, had been at his chairman's rounds, and an intern named Robert Wolf had presented a very interesting and baffling case to him. So now from two directions, he goes to see this patient, and very shortly after that, there are 3 additional cases that he becomes aware of in rapid succession. There were some things in common among these 4 cases. First of all, they were all young men, 30 years or younger. They all had an acute onset of opportunistic infections after being very healthy just a month or so before. They all had severe weight loss. They all died within months of pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. And very fortunately for Dr. Gottlieb, right down the hall from him there was a postdoc working on helper T cells, what we called then helper T cells, we now call them CD4 T lymphocytes. And this gentleman found from samples of blood in all of these patients a deficiency of helper T cells. One last thing, all 4 patients were gay. Gottlieb did just what the rest of us would do. He went out, he searched the literature, he couldn't find anything like this. He began to think to himself, wow. This is what he said to me. Hey, this is what you're here for. You are meant to do new things, find new things, and eureka, you're going on to something that's going to further your ambitions. Your job now, Michael, is to get this into print and be credited for having discovered something new. Now, in the same thought, he said to himself, wow, these young men are dying, and there's nothing I seem to be able to do for them. What could this possibly be? If this were you, a man who's just in his first year, he doesn't really have a mentor locally. As it turns out, he didn't really have mentors very much throughout his entire life. What would you do? Anyone? Well, he certainly didn't do what I would have done. He was a lot more fearless than I. He called Arnold Relman. Arnold Relman was the editor, probably the most famous editor of our time in the New England Journal of Medicine. And he was a towering figure. He was known by many as the conscience of medicine. He invented the idea of the medical-industrial complex, and he railed against conflict of interest among physicians. Michael Gottlieb. I placed one phone call. I didn't play telephone tag. I spoke with a reasonable man who screened the call, and he transferred me to his boss. I said, here's what I have. And he asked me a number of questions. Are you sure of this? Are you sure of that? I said, yes, I think so. Now, Arnold Relman did more than that for Mike Gottlieb. He said, you have to protect the public, and you have to protect your primacy in having discovered this disease. So you should publish first in the MMWR, the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Review, I think it is, yes. At any rate, you should publish in the MMWR, and I'm going to put aside, I'm going to hold in abeyance the famous Inglefinger rule, the notorious Inglefinger rule that said the New England Journal of Medicine will not publish anything that you have in some way communicated to the public before you waited, before it was published in the New England Journal. And sure enough, on December 10th, 1981, the New England Journal of Medicine published its lead article, Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia and mucosal candidiasis in previously healthy homosexual men. Evidence of a new acquired cellular deficiency. Now, people had been seeing this disease for a long time. There were sporadic cases in virtually every big city you could name. But nobody leapt to the idea that this was an entirely new and important disease. Why Gottlieb? What was there about Gottlieb that led him to make this startling discovery? He said, unlike many physician researchers, I was always case-oriented. On my first day as a medical student at the University of Rochester, our class was admonished to learn to accept uncertainties in medicine. We did not seek to verify a particular diagnosis. We tolerated uncertainty. Now, under normal circumstances, if this were you, you'd move on. You would be starting to research how this disease is caused, what its transmission was, how to begin to treat it. But Gottlieb got sidetracked. He got sidetracked by things that he was in no way prepared to handle. And namely, that was an author fight. So as Gottlieb started to revise his manuscript in the New England Journal, word got around. And one of the people who got an early look at it was the intern, Robert Wolfe, who had referred the case to Gottlieb. And it turned out that when he presented to Shine, he presented this as a case that was absolutely unique. He didn't see what Gottlieb saw, but he raised a great deal of interest. What's more, when Gottlieb sent Shanker around for blood, his fellow Robert Shanker, they cut a deal. Wolfe said that if I give you the blood, I need to be an author on any manuscript that comes out of this. But he was left off. Gottlieb never heard about this deal. So Wolfe went to Gottlieb. He said, look, I got this arrangement. And Gottlieb sort of blew him off. So he went to the chairman. He said, Ken Shine called Gottlieb into his office. And this is what he said. This is what Kenneth Shine told me. I saw the manuscript of the New England Journal. I remember saying to Gottlieb, why is Bob Wolfe not listed as a co-author? Gottlieb said that he was just the referring physician, that he was more than just the referring physician. It was the beginning of a new antagonism, one that Gottlieb couldn't possibly win. Andrew Saxon also called Gottlieb into his office and said, I want to be an author on this paper. Make me an author on this paper, and you can carry this disease. It wasn't called AIDS then. He called it GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. You can carry this forward on your own. Andrew Saxon. We walk in the room, and he has a candida granuloma on his finger, all swollen up, and the patient was clearly gay. He was overtly gay. He was dramatically gay. This is the second patient. Now, that's when the light came on. There was more than one of these. So we discussed this. It was really exciting stuff, this new disease. So that's the paper. I was actually involved intellectually. Gottlieb didn't necessarily agree. What was I going to say? He was my immediate boss. He suggested adding one sentence to the discussion. We cannot rule out the possibility that an unidentified exposure toxin or microbe played a role in the development of the immune deficiency in these patients. Does that one cover-your-ass statement qualify him to be an author? As things turned out, he was right. Gottlieb had put his money on a variety of CMV cytomegalovirus. So what happened afterward? Well, Gottlieb his career shot off meteorically in ways, most of us here are probably very accomplished, even the more junior people. You can't imagine what happened to Gottlieb. All of a sudden, he was invited around the world. He hobnobbed with the elite of medical and scientific worlds. There's one wonderful anecdote his wife Cindy told me, actually. They had gathered a group of people that seemed to recur at these various meeting sites, and they called it the AIDS Discovery Club. And they would hold separate little social functions for themselves. And one day, they were at a party for the AIDS Discovery Club, and she's talking to Jonas Salk. And a plate of canopies comes by, and she picks one off, and she begins to look at it, and she says, this looks like duck. Is this duck? And Dr. Salk took it from her, popped it in his mouth, and said, yes, it is. The other thing that tended to make people angry was he seemed very interested in talking to the media. And all of this together sort of got Michael Gottlieb full of himself. And he thought, and this is what he told me, I'm going to become full professor, and eventually I'm going to become dean. So he had the idea of an academic career. This was what he really wanted. And about a year, he's a year and a half into his tenure clock. And the clock's ticking, but very quietly. And certainly it seemed as though the sky's the limit for this young man's career. Resentment began to develop between himself and his division head. Andrew Saxon felt that Michael Gottlieb really hadn't done any research at all. He'd just been lucky. The virologists who found the virus were the really clever ones because retroviruses were new. They had to go after the problem intellectually, not just trip over something. So he's really very distinctive. Michael Gottlieb, in response, he was an only child, treated as brilliant his whole life, a Harvard grad. But here I was in close quarters with him. He was supposed to mentor my career development, but he was never supportive, always undermining. And I have many separate individuals I interviewed who would agree with this assessment. Andrew Saxon agreed with parts of this. I wasn't supporting him fully, which is true, I was not. I don't remember anything personal or research-wise. I mean, his research was HIV, and mine was B-cell immunoglobulins. I was well-funded throughout my career. I didn't need to work on AIDS. It sounds a little defensive, actually, at least to me. But again, resentments were developing at even higher levels. Kenneth Shine said of him, he was talking to the media, very self-promoting, and the result was a whole series of articles. I wasn't present when he was having his conversations with the media, but it was clear where he was coming from, meaning he was trying to build his own image. Gottlieb disagrees again. A major complaint about me was that I was self-promoting, but I felt the charge was unfair. It was intended in part to promote and add to the stature of the medical school and the hospital. Sounds a little defensive to me as well. A lot of defensiveness going on here. The real problem was there was an absolute conflict in sort of the ethical realm. Here was Gottlieb, raised as a lower middle class child. His father died when he was a teenager. He never really was able, after his father died, to have the mentoring that he felt he really needed. And he felt that the deck was stacked against him at UCLA. That UCLA, in the end, would have much preferred if somebody else had discovered the disease any place other than UCLA. The problem with UCLA, he thought, was that this was a not-for-profit, but really, in every sense, the way it acted, the institution acted, a for-profit institution. And that they didn't want the AIDS patients who didn't have health insurance or had very poor paying Medicaid. That the reputation of the UCLA as an AIDS hospital would hurt, not help the institution, because it was really into the idea of developing its organ transplantation. And recruitment for training programs might suffer as well. There was insufficient, in his view, Godlin's view, insufficient space and money being allotted to him and to his clinical and research programs in AIDS. And this is a continuing theme throughout his tenure. Kenneth Shine disagrees again. Our policy was that we would take care of these patients who were suspected of having a diagnosis of AIDS. We would not turn patients away, and overall, we had an extremely good relationship with the gay community. They came to grand rounds and were presented as cases. Don't you think that listening to what they're actually saying is better than anything I could do for myself in this book? So, January, I just want to take you back to 1982 now. 1982 is really the year after the discovery of AIDS, and it's right up in the New England Journal. In January of '82, CDC was reporting a new AIDS case every day. By June of '82, 2 to 3 cases a day, 27 states, 8 foreign countries, and with a very high death rate. It's still with us today. It was doubling and doubling and redoubling, and nobody was paying attention. Government particularly did not recognize this as an epidemic. It was ignored by the administration officials. The Reagan, as I mentioned already, the Reagan administration acted as though it didn't exist. And there was no funding response. This was not like, for instance, Legionnaire's disease about the same time. where the single outbreak in Philadelphia caused an enormous flow of money to occur. No funding, virtually no funding for AIDS. There was intense fear, and the main fears were especially associated with gay men, healthcare workers, and AIDS researchers. I talked to a fellow who later became the director of the National Cancer Institute, Samuel Broder. He actually said to his researchers, if you feel this is too dangerous for you, get out now. And he was perfectly willing to let them do so. There was something there seems to be a lot of sort of perverse humor associated with AIDS. Andy Saxon told me about the 4-H Club. The 4-H Club were heroin addicts, hemophiliacs, Haitians, and of course homosexuals. It was still, despite the fact that this was spreading, the heterosexuals in the population still thought of as a gay disease and therefore heavily discriminated against. Jerry Falwell again. AIDS isn't God's judgment on homosexuals. AIDS is God's judgment on a society that tolerates homosexuals. There was a coterie of conservative congressmen that suppressed recognition of AIDS and in fact wouldn't even allow hearings to be on the subject to be held. AIDS needed a white knight, and one appeared. That man being Henry Waxman. Henry Waxman actually is just retiring now after I think 30 years in Congress. But he was the first to wish to hold hearings. He couldn't get anything going in Washington, so he took it out to West Hollywood. The first congressional hearings were held in Hollywood in 1982. Henry Waxman, when asked, well, aren't you doing this just because you represent a sizable gay population? He said, no. And what if I were? I mean, in Pennsylvania, they're representing steelworkers, and we see lots of lobbying for steelworkers. He said, no, I work on this issue because it's the largest public health crisis of our time. I work on this issue because I am a Jew, and I understand what it means if your society doesn't care whether you live or die. That might have been the end of it, except that one day in 1984, in June 1984, Gottlieb got a phone call from a private practicing dermatologist, sort of the dermatologist to the stars in Los Angeles, in Beverly Hills. And she said, I can't tell you who we're talking about, but can you come out and see this patient? The patient turned out to be Rock Hudson, one of the biggest movie stars of his time, perhaps of any time. He had a purplish mark on his arm that actually had been seen by Nancy Reagan. She was the first to point it out to him. He came back. He went to his dermatologist, Dr. Bussell, and she called, as I said, Michael Gottlieb. Gottlieb made the diagnosis of AIDS and began to care for Rock Hudson, even though there was no available treatment at the time. Hudson underwent a number of experimental treatments. He was on his way to the Cannes Film Festival. He stopped in Paris for one of these experimental treatments that Gottlieb had arranged for him, and he collapsed in the lobby of the Ritz Hotel. He was hospitalized in Paris. His publicist confirmed that he had AIDS. Didn't say anything about his sexuality, though it was well known that, in fact, he was homosexual. At any rate, a huge uproar ensued. Pierre Salinger called Michael Gottlieb, asked that he be transferred back to Los Angeles to UCLA, and rented a 747, an Air France 747, that he was the sole occupant to have he and his nurses to take him back to Los Angeles. Michael Gottlieb. My being Rock Hudson's physician attracted a lot of national attention. Several prominent members of the faculty wanted to take part in Hudson's care. There were people in the faculty who demanded to be called in to consult. When I said no, they got angry. I should have been much more political and said, oh, of course. Gottlieb was isolating himself from the rest of the UCLA faculty. Now, Rock Hudson's death in early October of 1985 was a real watermark, a real change in what was happening with AIDS. A lot of people sympathized that would not have ordinarily sympathized with the condition of homosexuality and with AIDS. Bruce Decker, an AIDS activist, said Hudson's illness and death have moved the fight against AIDS ahead more in 3 months than anything in the previous years. Hudson, before he died, had in fact left $250,000, real money at the time, $250,000 to Michael Gottlieb to do what he thought would be best, to help to begin to fight this disease and to show that in fact research into AIDS was critical. The film community, which had been very much against, or at least claiming that homosexuals are not involved in the film industry, most people would understand that this was a ridiculous thing to say, began to line up in favor because of the Hudson death. Elizabeth Taylor, in particular, who chaired the first large AIDS benefit, the one called, that was hosted by Project Los Angeles in 1985. So at any rate, how did Michael Gottlieb get involved with Elizabeth Taylor? Well, she showed up to visit Rock Hudson, and she went to seek out Hudson's doctor, Rock Hudson. They'd starred together in Giant, and Hudson was her friend. And she could see how nervous Michael Gottlieb was in her presence. She said to him, "I'm just a Jewish girl from Pasadena." She was. She had converted for her third husband, third out of 8. And one of the 3 things she said that she had loved most in the world, she had loved Michael Todd, she'd loved Richard Burton, and she'd loved jewelry. And so about 2 weeks later, she calls Gottlieb. She says, "I want to see my friend Rock again. I don't want to run the gauntlet of all those newspapers and media and so forth." And so he arranged to take her in the back way. He picked her up in Bel Air, drove her in what he describes as his 10-year-old van to the back entrance, took her up a freight elevator, and when the elevator stopped, he hears a loud clunk. And he said, "What was that?" And she holds out the Krupp diamond, the 32-carat Krupp diamond, and says, "Oh, it's only my jewels." At any rate, in 1985, we now have a full-blown worldwide epidemic. The modes of transmission, that being sexual, have been established. Researchers at the Institut Pasteur have discovered the etiology, the viral cause of AIDS. They called it LAD, it eventually became HIV. Robert Gallo and other NCI researchers developed a test for HIV infection, and AZT was under investigation. Bill Meisenheimer, who was the director of AIDS Project Los Angeles and who held that very large benefit with Elizabeth Taylor as a chair, said that there are 3 big draws in the world: Elizabeth II, the Pope, and Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor was a natural when Gottlieb wanted to use that $250,000, and she became his spokesperson for the foundation that he developed. They all got together at a restaurant that Elizabeth Taylor had picked out in Santa Monica. Michael Gottlieb, we were an unlikely group. A doctor, a Xerox executive turned activist who was openly gay, that was Bill Meisenheimer, and the greatest living movie star in the world. But that night it all gelled. We were like kids, co-conspirators. We sat there saying we must do something. Elizabeth Taylor said, "We decided that night we were going to make a difference. Goddamn we would." Now, I don't have time to tell you the story of Michael Gottlieb and Ann Parr. It's detailed considerably in the book, and the relationship with Elizabeth Taylor is also discussed in this context. And in late September 1985, just before Rock Hudson's death, Gottlieb merged his foundation with a New York foundation headed by a woman named Matilda Krim. And there the 3 of them are, the first 3 from the left. I don't know who the 4th woman is, to be perfectly honest. And they're announcing the formation of AMPAR. And AMPAR, of course, has become an extraordinarily powerful research machine for any disease, but certainly for AIDS. And the clock is ticking. We're now at 5.5 years. Gottlieb's getting anxious. He wants to become an associate professor. He wants tenure. He goes up a year early for promotion. Here's the case for Michael Gottlieb. His curriculum vitae shows that he has an international scientific reputation. He's got letters of support for his promotion and tenure from 2 National Institutes that held directors and the Nobel Prize winners from the Institut Pasteur. He has 30 publications in really first-rate journals. It's 2 or 3 in the New England Journal, a couple in Lancet, a few in JAM, and so forth. And he's first author on 12 of them, 5 senior author publications. And he's just received word that he's the PI for UCLA of a $10.3 million NIAID award. So he's about to be well funded as well. Here's the case against Michael Gottlieb. Andrew Saxon. He was very bright. He was a good guy, but he got suckered by the entertainment industry. You know, the Rock Hudson thing, Elizabeth Taylor stuff. He got suckered by them. The inference is that he didn't keep his eye on the ball. He hadn't worked at his academics, despite what it said on the CD. I'll have more to tell you in a moment about that. Kenneth Schein. A large donor asked me, why don't you want to take money for AIDS research? So I said to him, what do you mean? You're actively accepting gifts. The man replied, well, I asked Dr. Gottlieb about giving money for research, and he said to me, give the money to AMPAR. This was very disturbing. Kenneth Schein again. It was increasingly clear that Michael was not respected by his colleagues. There were multiple issues. He was publishing all this stuff that he hadn't really done. The notion that he had divided loyalties between AMPAR and UCLA, whom he was dealing with, the celebrities, and that he was not very effective. This argument was offered both by Schein and by Saxon that he had some way coerced people putting him on as an author on papers where he had really not done the work. The validity of that I was unable to determine by asking others. Andrew Saxon again. It was like hawks. You know how they bite their food and then cover up with their wings and say it's my food? It was just too big to hold on to, and he pissed off a lot of the faculty. The outcome. Andrew Saxon's words, Mike and I are not friends. You know, he didn't get tenure, right? The reason he didn't get tenure was I wasn't supported. So here's his division head, the man who helped him put together his dossier for his promotion and tenure, saying that in fact he had helped Godleman with that, but not necessarily with promotion and tenure itself. He failed at the very lowest level, this department P&T committee. Here's Dr. Martin Shapiro, still the head of general medicine at UCLA, but a young tenured associate professor at the time. Saxon was a serious scientist, and that's what he wanted in his division. You could look at the decision and say either that Gottlieb had not sufficiently proven his academic mettle, or that the committee had voted down to discover the most important disease of the 20th century. Sounds hyperbolic, doesn't it? The most important disease in the 20th century. But for the 200th anniversary, New England Journal of Medicine published an article lauding, in essence, lauding its own work. But it did choose a handful of articles that it referred to as historical journal articles cited. One of these was Gottlieb's 1981 publication. Out of the hundreds of thousands of articles they published, one of them was Gottlieb's. He had numerous troubles other than promotion and tenure. The fact is that Ken Schein could have reversed that decision. He chose not to. He was dean at this point. He also had great numbers of family problems, particularly the death of his younger brother that occurred just about the same time. He chose not to give it another try. He entered community practice where he remains today. The contract, UCLA was able to keep it. They passed it along, in fact, to one of Gottlieb's antagonists, Dr. David Goldie. Gottlieb said, I saw myself as somebody on a mission, that at a time when other people weren't responding in a positive way to something tragic, horrible, I was doing what I thought was the right thing. The founding of AMPAR and my notoriety around the Rock Hudson period, and my availability to the press over the first 5 years of the AIDS epidemic, I hoped my seniors would see the merit and the benefit, but all those things had settled. Just a few words, lesson learned, and then we'll close and I hope we have time for questions. Gottlieb discovered AIDS because he was fearless. Not only did he focus on the patients, he dared to make a phone call that I simply would not have thought of at all. Even the possibility of it would have scared the dickens out of me. But by focusing on the patients, he was able to find commonalities. He saw the details. He avoided wedging it into some contradictory construct just because instead he left with the possibility there was something new. And that was thinking out of the box, and that was very important to his being the discoverer. no problem. I hope that you now recognize that UCLA and Michael Gottlieb were a poor fit. I think this occurs frequently, and it'd be absolutely dangerous to be both the institution and the individual. He didn't really keep his eye on the ball. I mean, the truth is he found an awful lot much more interesting and exciting than his academic work. And he alienated colleagues, he alienated his bosses. He never had a mentor. I can tell you that in the many conversations we had, he would mention this over and over and over again, that with the early death of his father, he felt he needed a mentor. He never found one that was suitable. I think this is general for all of us. Mentors are absolutely essential, not necessarily one individual for your lifetime, though that can work, but mentors progressively, perhaps over time, that can help you with institutional dynamics and also improve your decision making. A few lessons about the AIDS epidemic. Prejudice should not play a role. It played an enormous role in this story. Prejudice should not play a role for how we prepare for or react to new diseases. The world is very small. We have to act together. Regardless of how we feel about each other as nations, we have to act as though this is inside our borders, not outside. And that silence is the enemy. There was nothing but silence about AIDS because of the prejudicial effect of this focusing on homosexuality. We have to speak early and often and get the funding necessary to address new epidemics. So I'm very grateful, as I've said, for the invitation, for the chance to come home and to talk about this book. And I hope you're interested enough to perhaps seek it out and read it. I think it's a good story. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's a lot in that story, as we've all heard, that takes us back to an era that predates many in the room. But there are also some themes that I think are part and parcel of the professional lives we live today. So there's probably plenty of threads that people can introduce into the conversation. When I bring you the mic, and we have another mic on the other side, please identify yourself, and the floor is now open.
I gotta tell you, this is a really intimidating room. I suddenly realized I've probably been like this the entire time.
Thanks, Bruce, for bringing that to light. It has been my life, and I'm Brian Westway, I'm director of the HIV clinic here. Started the clinic here in '86, but trained in Boston, and there's some interesting parallels in both places. I did a medical center hour a few years ago where we were talking about some of these issues and how new epidemics change people's academic lives, and not always so nicely. Jerry Groupman was the co-discoverer of Captaincy and became chief of hemonc at my institution. We were pejoratively called after that the gay VA because everybody wanted to see Jerry.
I need to mention that he was an associate early on of Michael Gottlieb at UCLA before moving to Boston.
Absolutely. That's where the Captaincy Story began. And one of my co-residents, I was a senior resident, had a woman around 83, 84, came in with pneumonia and had none of the typical risk factors for HIV and had pneumocystis eventually discovered. The resident called up Jerry and said, I think I have an odd case of AIDS. There still wasn't an HIV test, obviously, or HDLV. And anyway, progressed. Jerry blew him off and said, no, that's not going to be, that's just going to be a screwball case. Eventually, though, they got interested when it found out she got a transfusion in the late 70s. Transfusion donor was still alive, a single donor was a gay male. And then Jerry called up Gallo, who had the new HDLV discovery, but no test, and they tested both people. This ended up being the case, the New England Journal case that documented definitively blood transfusion, where there was already speculative but not proof. And the resident said, I've already written up the case report to Jerry, I want to be on it. And Jerry goes, no, this is too big for you. and the resident's name never got on the report. So I think that happened on multiple levels. And then when I arrived here, we started the HIV clinic, some of us, and meaning got all of them under one roof in 86, 87, and got approached by the Albemarle magazine, our sort of local posh thing, and they wanted to do an article on AIDS in Albemarle, and naively said, sure. And we did it, and it got a cover and all of that, and then I was called up by the then CEO saying, how dare you do this? We don't want to be known as the AIDS hospital, same as UCLA, and so it continued to be an ongoing issue.
Yeah, very supportive, thank you.
Hi, Bruce. I'm John Ashley, the former CEO of the University of Virginia Hospital, and I can confirm that what Brian Wisboy just said was absolutely true.
Well, the history goes on. Everything is local. Somebody else? We didn't mean for that to end the conversation.
Let me just say a word about how I got started in the authorship business, because it is a local story, since we're telling local stories. I've always wanted to write, and I've written a lot medically and scientifically. But one day I get this announcement in the mail, and you probably still have things like this, that there was to be a 2-hour enrichment program one morning on creative writing. And it was being run by Danny Becker and Sharon Hostler, and I went. I went because I was chairman and I could do those sorts of things. And I spent 2 hours and I learned a lot, and at the very end Sharon gave us a sentence. I don't remember what the sentence was, but she said, write a paragraph, as though you were starting a novel on this sentence. And I did that, and then, maybe a week or so later, I get a call from Sharon. She said, well, I've been running, or I've been part of this critique group for a while now, and we have 6 women, and we think maybe it's time we let a man in, and we might be able to benefit that. Would you like to audition? I had to audition. And so I wrote a story called The Lemon, which eventually did get published in a literary journal, and they let me in. I was a raw writer, I really was, and these 6 women made me into a much, much better writer. They helped me by editing the entirety of my first book, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, that I wrote with Jeff Goldsmith. And that was the start of my writing career, so I'm very grateful.
I'm hi, Kosi Sifri from Infectious Diseases. I was just curious about what Dr. Gottlieb is now, like now. It sounds like he's sort of expressed his maybe frustrations with lack of mentorship, but just how is he now personally? How does he like practice? Does he have regrets?
So he still does have a private practice, virtually all of AIDS medicine. In fact, the genesis of the idea for this book was I went out to LA in about the mid-90s, and John Hanks, John, are you still here? John Hanks was both an undergraduate school and medical school classmate of myself, and he was a medical school classmate of Godleman. And he'd been out to LA and said, you got to go see Godleman, you got to see this practice. I spent a day in the practice. It was not sort of your poverty AIDS practice, it was your upscale AIDS practice, an awful lot of movie people. And but I was blown away by it. I had no idea, despite the fact that the disease had been around for 14 years, about how people were treated and the fear that still was present. And so I called up Gottlieb when I was done with the Einstein book, and we talked it over and we signed a contract. And we agreed I would be the sole author. Mike would get to look at stuff that I was writing. He could make suggestions, but I would decide what was in the book. And so we did it that way. And, well, I think that's just say that Mike is still in private practice. Well, thank you very much. It was great.